Thank you. Hello, thank you everyone for coming. Today we're here for our Yom HaShoah program. We've got a number of speakers which I'm very excited about. I would like to kick off our program by asking everyone to rise, please. Of course, it's customary to rise when the Torah is taken from the Ark. This is no ordinary Torah. This is a very special Torah. It comes to us from England via Czechoslovakia. This is a Torah that comes from the congregation of the town of Pardubice in the Czech Republic today. It was written in 1889. The Nazis overran Czechoslovakia. In 1940, they outlawed all religious practice. And in 1942, all of the Torahs and artifacts from the temple were removed and taken to a basement in Prague. There they remained until 1967. And in 1967, a group of Englishmen convinced the Czech government, Czechoslovakian government at the time, to sell the Torahs to them. So the Memorial Scroll Trust was set up, and hundreds of Torahs from all over Europe, but mostly Czechoslovakia, were exported to London. And in 1988, this particular Torah came to us here in Terre Haute. The town of Pardubice is roughly the same size as Terre Haute. And at the time that the congregation was closed, there were 500 families. After the war, only 10 people remained. We, under the terms of our agreement with the Memorial Scroll Trust, we read from this Torah at least once a year, sometimes more, but we always use it to remember what happened. And when we read it, it's an act of resistance. Please be seated.
Thank you, Scott. You can read more about the Pardubice Scroll and keep up with events happening at the temple on our website, unitedhebrewth.org. Our first speaker, Arthur Feinsod, taught theater and the humanities for more than 3 decades, concluding with 20 years at Indiana State University. He's won a number of teaching, research, and creativity awards, co-authored the Declaration of Innocence, included in the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act of 2021. He speaks today on the Warsaw Ghetto uprising and his experience writing the historical drama Coming to See Aunt Sophie.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you so much for coming this afternoon. Yeah, I want to focus on the tour that we took with Coming to See Aunt Sophie. I wrote it in 2014 for the 100th anniversary of the birth of Jan Karski, who, when I started working on this project, I did not know who he was. And a dear friend of mine told me who Jan Karski was, and I was just totally stunned and excited about his story and wanting to do a play. At the time, there was no play written about Jan Karski, so I took it upon myself to do a play, and in 2014, we toured it first to Germany. We opened in Mannheim, Germany, and then toured Poland. We started at Łódź, which is the town that Karski was born in and raised in. We then went to Kielce, and I'll tell you more about all that. And then we ended up at Warsaw at the Museum for the Polish Jews, which is located on the grounds of the old Jewish ghetto. But I'll tell you more about that as we go along. Oops, did I take my... I have clickers here. Oh, yeah. Okay, great. The world premiere took place in Mannheim, Germany, at the Here and Now Festival, and it was their 10th year anniversary. I was there for the first Here and Now Festival performance. I brought a production of Waiting for Godot when I was at Trinity College with my students. And that kicked off this festival that was still going on up until fairly recently. But we were there for the 10th year anniversary of the festival. It was a festival for English-speaking plays in Mannheim. And groups from England, Scotland, Ireland, and the United States participated. But we were the only ones from the U.S. that year. The American premiere of Coming to See Aunt Sophie occurred on the stage of the Crossroads Repertory Theater on Wednesday, July 2nd, 2014. And the Sunday afterward, we had a speaker named Thomas Wood, who wrote a book called Jan Karski, How One Man Tried to Stop the Holocaust. And he signed books afterwards, and it was very nice to meet him. I used his book a lot. There was a lot of information from his book that became very important in my writing of the play. Additional performances took place at the New Theater, as well as, of course, here at the United Hebrew Congregation, at Saint Mary-of-the-Woods, at Candles, and at the Unitarian Universalist Church. Because we had made the play so that it could be done on tour with no set and no costumes, we were able to take it pretty much anywhere in town where they wanted us. So that's why we performed it, and we chose those places for obvious reasons. Let me see. Let's see if I can get this to work. Oh, great. This is an image of Jan Karski at two different times in his life. The image on the left is Jan Karski as a courier for the Polish underground when he was in his 20s during World War II. And the image to the right is Jan Karski as a professor in his 60s at Georgetown University. The extraordinary thing about him is that he never talked about his heroics during World War II. So here he was, a professor teaching modern European history, and nobody knew about what he did during World War II until a French filmmaker interviewed him for the movie Shoah and asked him questions about it. He broke down in a highly emotional scene, but when he got his composure, he started to talk about his experiences. And many of those clips from that interview are in the movie Shoah. Some of you may have seen it. His students didn't know what he had done in Europe. So one of the extraordinary things was when the students found out that he was a hero of World War II, it was an extraordinary thing. The students stood up and applauded. And he didn't know this was going to happen. So you imagine coming for a lecture and suddenly your entire student body is standing applauding him for what he did during World War II. So it was a pretty extraordinary story. The idea of my play is the younger Karski and the older Karski communicate with one another. So the old Karski gets a chance to come to terms with his past in the course of the play. So while he's going through Nazi-occupied Europe and while he is dealing with Nazi torture and dealing with those awful experiences that he had, we have the old Karski watching it. So he's kind of watching his past unfold in front of him as he's talking to this French filmmaker about his past. So that's the conceit of my play. Okay. Doesn't want to move forward. Oh, was that moving forward? It was moving forward. I'm sorry. I didn't realize it was moving forward. I have two different sets of slides here, so. Okay. The person who played Old Karski is this person right here. So many of you know him. He has performed in many plays here in Terre Haute and around. Brad Venable played Old Karski brilliantly, if I may add. This is him at the Crossroads Repertory Theater in our world premiere. And this is Julie Dixon, who's head of acting at Indiana State and who I've had the pleasure of directing on many occasions. But she played, I think it was 25 different roles. And I think she reminds me all the time that she had to learn 15 different accents. But she still has forgiven me and expresses it in a positive way, which is very nice. So just a quick sort of some details about Karski's life. It's an extraordinary life. He was born in 1914, grew up in Łódź, Poland, where there's a very large Jewish community. He befriends Jews in his school and becomes very good friends with them, though there's this divide, obviously. He's a Catholic, they're Jewish, so, they communicated, but just in school. They didn't, hang out together after school type of thing. Karski became an officer in the Polish army when Germany and the Soviets agreed to gobble up Poland from the east and west in 1939. He was caught by the Soviets, and he went to a detention camp, and he was released in a prisoner swap with the Nazis. So he was like this exchange thing that happened between the Soviets and the Nazis. So he ended up in Nazi occupation rather than Soviet occupation, and he claimed it was, six of one, half a dozen the other, just awful, terrible in either situation. Anyway, he escapes during the transfer from the Soviets to the Nazis. He escapes on a train, and he gets caught, tortured, and attempts to commit suicide and is hospitalized. He escapes from the Nazis with the help of the Polish underground. This is all important information, I think, for what the play is about. My play has incidents that show all of these events in his life. He meets this amazing woman named Zofia Kosak, a famous Polish writer, and finds out about the Council to Aid the Jews, and he becomes a member. He meets with the top Jewish leaders. Now, this is in the middle of the Nazi occupation of Poland, but he met them as part of the Polish underground. He met Feiner and Kirschenbaum. Now, these were two Jewish men who were in charge of the Jewish side of the Polish underground. And they told him, they said, you don't know what's going on, but the Warsaw Ghetto has started to happen. Jews are in there, they're dying, they're not allowed out. And they said, the only way that you can do this is if you are an eyewitness of what's happening. So we're going to sneak you into the Warsaw Ghetto disguised as a Jew so you can see with your own eyes. So when you can report to the world, you can report about what the Jews are going through in the Warsaw Ghetto. So what did he see? These are the images of what he saw. He describes in one scene about a boy, about this boy's age, that he said his entire life he saw this boy's face before he went to sleep, well into his 60s. So he saw that, which is courageous in itself. But what was really extraordinary is that he felt he had to see an actual concentration camp. So he had the Jews sneak him into a concentration camp disguised as a Ukrainian guard. And of course the scene was trying to prevent any of the actual Ukrainian guards from seeing him because they would notice him that he's not one of them. So he would have to go in, and he watched as the Jews were carted off in trains to Auschwitz. And he was there in a holding cell watching this awful experience. Many of the Jews never made it to Auschwitz. Sometimes they would just take the train, take it to a place, and just leave the train like that and just let the people starve to death and die packed together. And he saw the beginning of that trip and then found out later what had happened to many of the people never even making it to Auschwitz. So this is the story that my play tries to tell. And a man who is tormented by these images that he has to take with him for the rest of his life. So what happens is, and this, by the way, is I believe, is the torture scene. Can't see it very well, but I think it is. This is the torture scene when he's being tortured by the Nazis, and there is the old Karski watching the young Karski being tortured. So he's trying to come to terms with what he experienced growing as a part of the Polish underground. He watches his own torture. That's one scene, for example. That's Julie Dixon, who's now playing a German guard with a German accent, as she will always remind me. This scene was so what happens to Karski is he goes to England to report to Churchill what he saw, because he said there's a Holocaust that's happening, and he tried to stop it. So he went to see Winston Churchill. He never got to see him. He was in the waiting room, in a waiting room, in a waiting room. He never got to see Winston Churchill. So he was frustrated. He jumped on a boat and went to the United States. By the way, as he got his way through Nazi-occupied Germany and France and Spain, he had the code phrase, "coming to see Aunt Sophie," so that people would recognize that he's part of the Polish underground or not recognize what he was doing as part of the Polish underground. That's where my title comes from, Coming to See Aunt Sophie. Anyway, he makes it to England, doesn't see Churchill, goes to the United States, and he does get to talk to FDR. And he does get to talk to Felix Frankfurter, who is the Jewish member of the Supreme Court. And he has a very interesting experience with both. With FDR obviously had other priorities besides saving the Jews, and so he was not all that attentive. And then he finally got to the Supreme Court Justice, Felix Frankfurter, a fellow Jew. He told his story, he told the whole account of the being in the Warsaw Ghetto, being in the concentration camp, and Felix Frankfurter didn't believe him. So we went to Mannheim, Germany. As I said, in the audience were people whose parents or grandparents were Nazis during World War II. Performing it was an extraordinary experience. And my wife and I were there together, and after the Act 1, there was no applause. And my wife and I walked out during the intermission. We walked down an alleyway and said, "Why do you think there was no applause?" And she said, "I don't know." "Do you think they just didn't like it? Did we offend them? What was going on?" Well, then a friend of ours from Spain came running up to us. They saw us coming down the alley, getting ready for Act 2, and she said that, how moved she was and how moved the audience was. And so I said, "Okay, maybe," but all right. So we got through Act 2, and then after Act 2, we had an extraordinary, probably the most incredible response I've ever gotten from anything that I've ever done. And it was really interesting. One of my dear friends came up to me afterwards, a friend from Germany, from Heidelberg, which is very close to Mannheim, came to see it and said, "Arthur, how can you still talk to me since my relatives were Nazis?" And I said, "Of course I talk to you, and I'm so appreciative that this had its opening in Mannheim, Germany. It's the place where it really needed to open." So we then went to 3 different locations in Poland. Each one was fascinating for its own reasons. We went to Łódź, which is, of course, where Karski was born. And we got an extraordinary response there. And one of the responses that we had was from this man. Let's see. This was in Łódź. In Łódź, we went to a park that was dedicated to Karski, And that's a sculpture of Jan Karski, and on either side is me and my stage manager of the production, Charles Adams. But it was a beautiful, beautiful park, all dedicated to Jan Karski in his native town of Łódź. He's a real Polish hero, and you see lots of statues of him throughout Poland. So in Łódź we had, let's see, I think the next one should be. This gentleman is the Polish representative to the European. To the European Union. There's another commercial. Was the representative to the European Union from Poland, and he was so moved by our play that he said, "I would like your play to be performed on the floor of the European Union," which is amazing. And many months went by, didn't hear from him. I finally heard from his secretary asking me for a budget. I put together a budget, and I sent the budget to them. And they said, "I think it's too expensive for us to bring you guys over, sorry," and it didn't happen. I kicked myself because I really feel I could have done a fundraiser here and paid for half of it from Terre Haute. I'm sure I could have, but I didn't think of it at the time, so it never happened, unfortunately. But anyway, that's the man who is the Polish representative to the European Union. So the net result is that it was extraordinary, but probably the most extraordinary time in our tour was when we went to Kielce, Poland. Let me say a word about Kielce. Kielce had a pogrom that they are very ashamed of. The pogrom was that the Jews coming back from the concentration camps went back to reclaim their homes, and their homes had been occupied by other people. And while they were coming back to reoccupy their homes, they were beaten and murdered. 42 Jews were murdered in Kielce. Many others were very badly injured in trying to go back after the concentration camp. And so, in fact, let me see if I can. This is the theater in Kielce where we performed. We had an extraordinary response there, and this has never happened to me in my life as a playwright, where during the intermission there was a long line of people who wanted my autograph. And I didn't even, the only autographs I gave was, for people to, skip taking a class or something at Indiana State. But here I am now giving these autographs. And I think part of it was because they felt such weight of this experience of having murdered 42 Jews. And in fact, and I'll show you this. This, by the way, is another sculpture of Jan Karski in Kielce. But this, you can't read it, but I can only tell you that this particular item, let's see. Oh, I'm going the wrong direction, that's the problem. What it says basically is this is to commemorate the 42 Jews that were killed in this town square in Kielce in 1946, and it was a kind of homage to, a kind of atonement, if you will, of what happened in Kielce to Jews coming back from the concentration camp in Kielce. But it was pretty extraordinary to have that experience of ours in this theater. Anyway, so we then went to the culmination of our tour to Warsaw. Folks, this was at the newly opened Museum for Polish Jews that was opened in Warsaw on the grounds of the old Jewish ghetto. It had just opened. We were the first performance on the stage in Warsaw. And the experience was extraordinary. Let me just say something about this museum. It was designed by a Finnish architect to mimic the image of Moses parting the waves in Exodus. And you could see the sort of wave-like exterior, and the interior has a similar kind of wave motif that goes through the architecture. And we were performing on the on the stage of this new extraordinary museum. And that's us, the actors, myself, the director, Dale McFadden, and we were there with members of the Polish community, people who were like head of the museum and that type of thing. But was really extraordinary, this is the talk that happened after the performance. In the audience were people who had been through the Holocaust, and one of the most amazing people that we saw, and this is me, by the way, talking on the stage, but this little dinner we had afterwards, I'm sitting next to Marian Turetzky, who is a Polish Jew who went through the Łódź ghetto, then went to Auschwitz, survived Łódź, survived the Auschwitz ghetto, but was weighed 70 pounds when he was liberated from Auschwitz, 70 pounds. And he is now a journalist in Poland. And I wanted to show you not only him, and by the way, right next to him is his wife, Halina, who was the film editor for Poland, for Roman Polanski before he came to America to do his films here. And in our discussion, they stood up, and what they said was really meaningful to us. Marian Turetzky, the journalist, knew Jan Karski. He was a very close friend of his. And he said how important this was for him to see this play. Halina got up and said that this play should be performed in every school in Europe because it really carries a message of a Catholic helping the Jews, somebody outside their own tradition, having the tradition, having the courage to step outside of their own tradition in order to help other people, and which I think is the final message of my play. And I was so glad that they got that, and that was something that they were able to take home from the performance. I want to show you this image because this brings it to pretty close to present time. This is Marian Turetzky. He's now 93 years old. It was in 2014. Of course, he was a younger man. Now he's 93 years old, and he was asked to talk about the Holocaust at the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And this is him at giving that talk. And what he said was pretty extraordinary. He said that Nazism did not come from nowhere, didn't drop from the sky. It started with language. It started with anti-Semitic comments that were ignored. And he said it built to the point where we now had extermination camps with the so-called final solution that Hitler wanted, which is to get rid of the Jews from the face of the earth. He said, be careful when the language is happening, when anti-Semitism is happening. Everybody has to stand up and stand against it. Otherwise, it's going to lead to things just like that. He was very controversial in saying this in Poland in 2020. The right-wing government was not happy with his comments. They disavowed what he said. They said that he was casting aspersions on the Polish people by talking about this kind of thing. But Turetzky had the courage, Turetzky, who had gone through the concentration camps, had gone through all this, had the courage to speak his mind and talk about this. I just want to end with this because it really brings it to our responsibility today. Crystal Reynolds is later going to talk about the African-American experience, the experience of slaves. And we really have a common problem in the sense that everyone probably here knows that anti-Semitism is getting worse and worse in America. But even as bad as it has gotten, it's not as bad as what it is for African-Americans. That just like Karski, a Catholic, helped the Jews, it is our responsibility to not only help ourselves stand up against against anti-Semitism, but also stand up against racism, stand up against any kind of hate to any group, not just our fellow Jews. And this is what Karski stood for, and that's why I'm so glad that Crystal's going to be talking about slavery, because once again, it's another thing from the past that still haunts us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arthur. Is this your clicker?
Oh, I think someone may need that.
Okay. Troy Fears is Executive Director at Candles Holocaust Museum and Education Center. He began working at Candles in July 2021. He's a lifelong resident of Terre Haute and has long experience in public education and nonprofits. He'll tell you today about Candles Museum, its mission, and strategic goals.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Troy Fears, and I am the Executive Director at Candles Holocaust Museum and Education Center, located just a few blocks from here. And I want to thank Scott and Betsy and everyone here at the Temple for allowing us to be part of today. It's a great day to be in Terre Haute, because this is a great community. And it's great to be able to see all of us come together, not just today to commemorate the 6 million Jews that were murdered in the Holocaust, but each and every day. As Arthur mentioned, anti-Semitism is increasing in our country each and every year, and it's increasing, unfortunately, here in Terre Haute as well. And I've been at Candles a year and a half now, almost 2 years, and we've had 5 anti-Semitic events occur during that time. And nothing serious, nothing major like the firebombing that happened at our museum in 2003. But each and every time I see that and it happens, it brings me joy to know that we live in a community where we get support from the mayor, Mayor Bennett, from our city police, the county, people like you that come together when those events happen and say, we're not going to allow this to happen in our community. We're not going to allow racism, bigotry, or anything of that nature to happen in our community. And that's what is nice about when those events happen. Obviously, you wish that they wouldn't happen, but it is nice to know that we live in a community that we support each other, we support different values, different beliefs, different backgrounds. We can come together as one, and that is the nice part. And so I just want to take a few minutes and invite you all to come to Candles. There's a lot happening at Candles Holocaust Museum and Education Center, not just this time of year for Yom HaShoah, but throughout the year. We try to do our best to provide programming, not just about the Holocaust, but throughout the year we talk on a variety of topics and try to have guest speakers talking about anti-Semitism and those types of, again, programs that we need to discuss in our community and that we are discussing, which is nice. But I invite you to attend. Again, I'm a lifelong resident of Terre Haute, and I can't tell you how many times I've been to Basler's or out in the community and people tell me, I've never been to Candles, or it's been years since I've been to Candles. And, we are Indiana's only Holocaust museum, and it's right here in our backyard, and I encourage you to come to check it out. We tell the story, obviously, of Eva Kor, our museum's founder, and her husband, Mickey Kor. We also tell Walter Summers' story, but we also tell the story of, and the memorialization, I guess, of 6 million Jews, and we tell those stories. And we encourage you to come check us out. We're trying to do new things each and every year. We're trying to update our exhibits as well. And so if you haven't been in a while, I encourage you to come by. A lot of what we do is educate our youth. And we had about 12,000 visitors to the museum last year. And I would say over half of those were students. And we're lucky to, again, live in a community where Holocaust education is important, and schools from all around the Wabash Valley come to Candles to learn about that. And it's important for us as an organization to educate our youth. And so none of what we're talking about today ever happens again. That's the big thing for us at Candles, and something we will continue to do as far as outreach and trying to reach the students, because we really do feel like this youth of our country is obviously the future, and in order for this to never happen again, we have to tell our youth about what happened in the past, so it never happens again. So with that, I'm going to bring up our next speaker, Dr. Alex Kor. Obviously, he's Eva Kor's son, a second-generation survivor. He's going to be talking about, obviously, his mom and dad and some anti-Semitism as well. You're going to be hearing about anti-Semitism throughout today's presentations. But Alex has become, he's a board member at Candles, and he's become a good friend and a good confidant for myself. And so just like to introduce to you Alex Kor.
Thank you very much. I was thinking the last time I was on the bima here, I was very nervous because I was very worried about my Torah portion. I think it was 1972 or 73, so it'd be either 50, 51 years ago. So hopefully I'm not as nervous today. So as Troy said, I want to thank Scott and Betsy and Arthur and Ken and Troy and Trent. And so, I have kind of a unique situation or, relationship to Terre Haute. I won't be able to step away. Nonetheless, about 13 months ago, I wrote an op-ed for the Times of Israel, If My Parents Were Alive, and it was in reference to the war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But on today, on the Yom HaShoah, I think it's important, similar to what the previous speaker spoke about, that we talk about anti-Semitism and perhaps, if my parents were still alive, what would they say? So there's no doubt that, anti-Semitism is a bigger problem. I just saw a statistic from in the last 4 months, the number of anti-Semitic events that occurred have doubled since 2022. And, for me, I continue to kind of think, what can I do to make a difference? And at times, I'm aware I watch a lot of sports, and recently Robert Kraft, I know he might not be a big fan here in Indiana, but Robert Kraft, of Jewish descent, the owner of the New England Patriots, started running ads on TV where I believe it's 2% of the population of the United States is Jewish, and in the last year or so, over 50% of the hate crimes have been against Jews. So we are targeted in this scenario, and I think it's important that we stand up against it. And so, as I think a lot now, I hear these voices sometimes, and I hear somebody saying, if I were still alive, I would do something about what's going on now. And then I see an older man with a Purdue hat and a Purdue sweatshirt typing away letters to the editor. And he's also along the same lines as the lady. And obviously, who are these two people? They're my mom and my dad. So I am the son of Mickey and Eva Kor. And I think it's important that some of you, probably most of you, know their story. Some of you may not. So we're going to talk a little bit about my mother, which most of you know. And unfortunately, my mom passed away. It'll be 4 years this past July in Krakow during one of our trips to Auschwitz. And, she obviously went to Auschwitz many, many times. So my mom, as you probably know, was born in Ports, Romania, was one of 4 girls, and her father was very religious, and they did have an opportunity to leave Romania. In 1943-44, things were getting bad in Hungary, Romania. If you know history, that part of the world was going to be saved supposedly by Hitler, but the Hungarian government made an agreement with Hitler, and they shortly invaded. My mom and her family were taken away on a cattle car, and they were on a 70-hour journey. Most of you probably know the story, but they were on a 70-hour journey, and during that time, they were not given a lot of food or water, and so they periodically, the train would stop for fuel, and at one point the language went from Hungarian to German. And so they obviously knew that they were in trouble. The cattle car eventually opened to mass chaos, and that was the last time my mom saw her father and her two older sisters. Shortly thereafterwards, they were on this platform. Obviously, we know it as the selection platform. And my mom was always dressed identical as my aunt. They were twins, and their mother was holding them. And at one point, a Nazi's running up and down the selection platform, yelling "twins, twins" in German. And they recognized that my mom and my aunt were twins. And the last thing my mom remembered was my mom and her aunt being taken away, and her mom's arms crying and holding out. And that was the last image my mom had of her mother. And if any of us, and if you want to come to Auschwitz, we do go yearly, and I know the exact spot that my mom knew, the spot that she last saw her mother. And so, obviously, my mom then became part of the Mengele experiments. There was a Nazi doctor named Joseph Mengele, did experiments on twins, and he would inject one twin with a substance, another one as a control, and over a period of time, if one twin died during the experiments, the other one would be killed, and they would do comparative autopsies. One story that I'll tell you, which some of you may know, some of you may not, August of 1944, my mom was looking up at the sky, and she sees a plane circling Auschwitz to mark not to bomb within Auschwitz. And my mom recognized that the plane was from the United States. And I think I heard this story when I was 12 years old. And I said, "Mom, how would you know that the plane was from the United States? There was no internet, there was no TV." Well, she had an aunt that lived in Cleveland, Ohio, and they would get letters when she was a young child from Cleveland, Ohio, and she recognized the stamp from those letters was on the plane. And so most people know that was used to mark so they would not bomb within Auschwitz. And so moving through the fall of 44, by late 44, the twins knew that the Nazis were kind of losing the war at times. They would the guards would not be around. And so, as you probably know the story, and I'll try to find this picture. Trying to coordinate this is a little bit of a challenge. So this is my mom, this is my aunt. And so that's the liberation picture. As many of you would know, my mom, to her dying day, liked attention. And so she rushed to the front of the line. And that was probably the 9th or 10th time they were shooting video. And if you know the story, she actually stuck her tongue out during this video. But it's a still shot from a video. After the war, my mom and my aunt didn't know where to go. They didn't know if the parents survived. They were in an orphanage in Katowice, near Krakow, and near Auschwitz. Shortly thereafterwards, Mrs. Changra, who's was a mother of one of the other twins, came to the orphanage saying that she was an aunt, took my mom and my aunt, and eventually they ended up back in their village. They thought that since they survived, their parents would have survived. They unfortunately found out that both parents were killed, and the two older sisters were killed. As my mom would tell you the story, the family dog was still there, so the Nazis killed people, but they saved dogs. Within a couple of years, Romania became communist. My mom was in a communist party reluctantly. She thought the Nazis were bad, the communists were obviously no better. Eventually, she made her way to Israel, and As some of you know, she was in the Israeli army. My aunt married a sovereign Israeli native, and my mom was still single at the age of 27, so she thought she was an old hag. We'll switch stories here, and I'm going to try to catch up, because some of you probably know my mom's story, but you probably don't know my father's story. And so my father was from Riga, Latvia, and he unfortunately passed away about a year and a half ago. Big Purdue fan, and so but he was from Riga, Latvia. Similar to my mom, he was a son, one of four boys. My mom was one of four girls. 1939 or 40, Riga was invaded much sooner than Hungary, Romania, and so one of his brothers was killed. He was on the Latvian Navy. They found out he was Jewish. They killed him, threw him overboard. His father was killed shortly thereafter. So at some point, my dad was in a ghetto in Riga, the Riga Ghetto, and they would liquidate the ghetto. Liquidate the ghetto meant who would live and who would die. And so my father initially went with his mother. My dad was 13, 14, but he looked much younger. And so he went with his mother in the line, or the area where the younger children and women would be. His mother realized what was happening, and she pushed my dad into the line with the two older brothers, and that saved his life. And my dad, if he were here, would probably be crying, because he always had a little bit of a guilt conscience. And so sometimes I get emotional as well. Nonetheless, my father was with two brothers. One brother, Shlomo, killed a Nazi and eventually made it to Israel. My dad and his brother Leo were together for approximately 4 years. And I will tell you that in April, in fact, 78 years ago, yesterday, my dad was liberated near Buchenwald concentration camp. Some of you may know the story. He was liberated by an American unit. The leader of that unit was from, of course, Terre Haute, Indiana. And that's how my father ended up in Terre Haute. Let me just check out the slides so I'm keeping up. I apologize. So my father, just to make the story complete, and then we'll kind of get to the essence of what I'd like to say. My father, after the war, didn't speak much English, but quickly learned English, and Lieutenant Colonel Neff was now back in Terre Haute, and my father desperately wanted to come to the United States. This was freedom for him. And so Mr. Neff, Lieutenant Colonel Neff, said, you need to write letters, and hanging out with the GIs that helped liberate him, he wrote a bunch of letters. We have a whole file of these letters. I believe this is one of the letters. And shortly thereafter, by May of 47, my dad was here in Terre Haute, having learned English over about the last 2 years, and enrolled in state lab school. And then eventually, which some of you may know the story, I know there's some people in the audience that know this, and let me backtrack. When my dad was liberated by the troops, American troops, they gave him a Coca-Cola. And my dad, when I was a young boy, we never had Pepsi. I didn't know what Pepsi was because we had Coca-Cola at every meal. And this is my dad in Vienna with a Coca-Cola malt. And Coca-Cola was his pride and joy. It was his champagne. And so once he entered high school and then college here, he became a big basketball fan, but he didn't know how to play basketball. And so he wanted to learn how to play basketball. And at the time at Indiana State Teachers College, or some of you in the audience may know the story, the basketball coach was also the gym teacher, and that basketball coach was somebody by the name of John Wooden. So Coach Wooden taught my dad how to play basketball, and they became friends, and obviously 2 years later, Coach Wooden went to UCLA. 2 years later, my dad entered pharmacy school at Purdue, and years later, in the late 90s, Indiana State honored Larry Bird, and Coach Wooden, my dad, sat at his table and took a picture with him. So I was born a couple years later, and over the years, I've been to Auschwitz probably over 25 times. The first time I went was in 1985, and we're going again here in a couple months. And you might ask, what does this all have to do with anti-Semitism? I think it has a lot to do with anti-Semitism, because one of the things that my mom would do is not only tell her story, but she was very, very vocal about her past and how to prevent the future. You know, I think there's an organization a friend of mine runs in East Coast, Stacy Gallen, is Remember the Past, Protect the Future. And I think that that little saying is very important nowadays because, as we've talked about, anti-Semitism continues to rear its ugly head. During the pandemic, there were more and more people that would use the internet to voice their concerns, hate groups. And so my mom and a lot of other survivors used the internet for a good thing. So before my mom passed away, she would tweet a lot, and she tweeted about anti-Semitism. And I think this is very, very important that we continue to voice our concerns. You know, I'd like to just kind of end here at the end. I know we're running over, and I apologize. But, you know, the last couple days of my mom's life, we were in Poland. And we were during one of our trips to Auschwitz. And we were sitting around the hotel, and I said, Mom, you know, you're getting a little older. Maybe you should, you know, slow down a little bit. And she said, slow down? What do you mean? I have so much work to do. And so I leave you with one thought, and that thought is that each one of you has a very important voice. Whether you're 10 years old, I see some youngsters here, whether you're 85 or 90 years old, I think it's very, very important that each one of us in our own way does something to make this world a better place. And so whether you have access to the internet or whether you have access to your church group or whether you are Jewish and would like to be more involved, I think my mom would tell you one thing, that you should wake up every morning and think of one thing you can do to make the world a better place. And with that in mind, and with this being Yom HaShoah, I would encourage you, knowing that anti-Semitism continues to rear its ugly head, that this is one opportunity for you all to be involved. Thank you very much. I apologize for the logistics here. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Dr. Crystal M. Reynolds is a historian by training and practice who has taught at multiple colleges and universities. She's been honored for her groundbreaking research in the areas of local history and the history of people of color. She's the author of A History of the African American Students' Experience at Indiana State University and is a contributor to the upcoming History of Indiana State University, Volume 2. Dr. Reynolds will describe two heroic yet forgotten uprisings, the 1811 German Coast Uprising and the 1943 Bialystok Ghetto Uprising.
No pressure there. Thank you. And I will keep the mask on as long as I can. Is that my water? Is this my water? Oh, that's somebody else's. Okay, that's okay. I don't need any. So I think when I was listening to Dr. Kor, I was hoping he had mentioned the historic event with John Wooden and Clarence Walker and the whole 1946 and 1947 basketball teams, but he probably just ran out of time, and I'm so glad he talked about his father and his mother, because I do believe in putting a face to a name, and so I really enjoy that. So John Wooden and that whole team in Indiana State Teachers College was really, those years, they're my heroes, because Clarence Walker was African American basketball player who actually desegregated the Indiana State Teachers College basketball team. There was never a black person on the team before, and it was the courage of John Wooden and the support of Terre Haute, as well as the whole basketball team, that supported this. And then when they were denied, and this is not my presentation is different, but I have to say this. And then when the team when Clarence Walker was not allowed to play in the NAIB tournament, well, it was NAIA at the time, NAIB, then NAIA, the postseason tournament, and John Wooden said, if he can't go, we can't go. The whole team supported this. So did Terre Haute and Indiana State. Eventually, the NAIB, NAIA was desegregated, and that because of the courage of several people, including Wooden, Clarence Walker, the whole team, in Indiana State and Terre Haute. And so I have been working very hard to get a monument to recognize not only the courage of Clarence Walker, the first African-American player, but the whole ISU team, that 46-47 team. It was 46-47, and then they were denied that year. Then 47-48, they accepted the invitation, and they were able to play. He was able to play. So that whole group of people, the 2 years Wooden was here. So I've been trying to get a monument to that. So I was so happy when he mentioned John Wooden and his father. Okay, that took 5 minutes, so I know I was given 20 to 25 minutes, and I timed this just right for 23 minutes, and I just took 5 minutes. So y'all bear with me, if that's okay. So Jewish and black people, and I wrote it out because if I write it out, I notice I won't ad-lib too much, and I can get through my presentation. Jewish and black people in America have so much in common. Great taste in food, and that's just the first sentence, okay. Great taste in clothing, and a deep connection to the Creator. But unfortunately, we also share a common tragic past. In the Bible and in history books, we learn of the enslavement of the Jewish people, and in U.S. history books, we know too well of the enslavement of the black race. But what we also share in common is the triumph of the Spirit and our amazing resilience and our resistance to tyranny. Today we have heard about the Warsaw Uprising and the brave men and women who fought against oppression. But there are countless historical examples of both groups who fought against tyranny that have gone unnoticed, unreported, hidden history, if you will. One such example is that of the Bialystok Uprising in Poland in the 1940s. I am only going to briefly summarize the Bialystok Uprising, but I hope in the future to do the story more justice. I hope to come back and be able to do it more justice when I've done the type of research I like to do, which is deep, deep research. In the German Soviet pact of 1939, Bialystok, a city in northeastern Poland, was assigned to the Soviet zone of occupation. Soviet forces entered Bialystok in September 1939 and held it until the German army occupied the city in June 1941, following the German invasion of the Soviet Union. In the early days of the German occupation, German police battalions rounded up and brutally killed thousands of Jews, men, women, and children in Bialystok. Man's inhumanity to man. In August 1941, the Germans ordered the establishment of a ghetto in Bialystok. Tragically, approximately 50,000 Jews from the city and the surrounding region were confined in a small area of the city. That number, 50,000, is just a little less than the size of Terre Haute. The ghetto had two sections divided by a river. Similar to the enslaved Africans on the plantations in the South, most of the Jewish people in the Bialystok Ghetto worked in forced labor projects, primarily in large textile factories located within the ghetto boundaries. The Germans also sometimes used Jews in forced labor projects around the ghetto. In February 1943, approximately 10,000 Bialystok Jews were deported to Treblinka, the notorious extermination camp. During the deportations, hundreds of Jews, mainly those considered too weak, too sick to travel, were murdered. In August of 1943, the Germans mounted an operation to destroy the Bialystok Ghetto. German forces and local police auxiliaries surrounded the ghetto and began to round up Jews systematically for deportation to Treblinka. Approximately 8,000 Jews were held in a central transit camp in the city before deportation. Those deemed fit to work were sent to the Madame camp, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. In Madame, another humiliating screening for the ability to work was done, and then after that, these people were transported to concentration camps, like Blitzen. Those deemed too weak to work were brutally murdered. And once again, it was men, women, and children. While this is hard history to narrate, it is truth-telling, and truth-telling is necessary. During the August 1943 deportations, when all hope for survival within the ghetto was almost lost, the Bialystok Ghetto underground staged an uprising against the Germans. In an attempt to break out of the ghetto and join fellow Jews in nearby forests, armed Jews attacked German forces near the ghetto fence along Somler Street. The fighting in the northwestern section of the ghetto lasted about 5 days. Hundreds of Jews died in this battle. 71 Jewish fighters were killed after being discovered in a bunker and captured by the Jews. But miraculously, more than 100 Jews managed to escape from the ghetto and join partisan groups in the Bialystok area. While written narratives of the Bialystok uprising state that the uprising was unsuccessful, the success lies in the act of resistance itself. And I'm going to repeat that. The success lies in the act of resistance itself. In July 1944, the Soviet army would drive the Germans out of Bialystok. The story of Bialystok is not well known, but is an example of people who reassert their humanity and redeem the honor of their people. The story of Bialystok is not well known, but it is an example of people who reassert their humanity and redeem the honor of their people. So similar to the Jewish uprising in Poland that remains largely hidden history, there is another uprising that is also hidden history. This is one among African people, black people, if you will, in Louisiana. The remaining of my time will discuss this uprising to shed light on the incredible shared experience of the Jewish and black peoples of this country. Freedom or death, freedom or death, freedom or death. No, these are not the words of the patriots in the 1770s and 1780s America, but rather these are the words of the men and women who participated in the largest uprising of enslaved people in the United States. And yes, I said women, men and women. The 1811 German Coast Uprising is truly hidden history. One of the most suppressed and hidden stories of African and African American resistance history is the story of the 1811 German Coast Rebellion. The 1811 uprising. The 1811 German Coast Uprising. The aim of the uprising was the establishment of an independent republic, a black republic in Louisiana. Approximately 500 enslaved Africans from 50 different countries, 50 different languages, would wage a fight against United States troops and territorial militias. This uprising has evaded the attention of most historians. Very few people know of the events surrounding this act of resistance of the horrible institution of U.S. slavery. Some historians argue that the reason this uprising was and is still hidden history is because immediately after the event, slave owners started controlling the narrative, engaging in a sort of 21st century fake news, if you will. The slave masters did not want word to get out that there was a huge uprising. They wanted people to think that enslaved people were satisfied with their lot in life, that their slave masters were kind and considerate, and that all was well in the slave universe. Local and state newspapers barely covered the events, and when they did, they referred to it as a small skirmish that was contained. They wanted to perpetuate the myth of the happy slave, if you will. Well, the 19th century media squashing of the revolt succeeded. It succeeded well into the 20th century, And that is when the true story was uncovered due to the extraordinary work by historians and researchers. The research on this uprising continues, however. There is so much we do not know. The 1811 German Coast Uprising began in St. John the Baptist and St. John's parishes in Louisiana, about 30 miles upriver from New Orleans. At that time, New Orleans was the capital of what was called the Orleans Territory. New Orleans was founded in 1718, and that's like over 300 years ago. The uprising sought to capture the city of New Orleans and make it the capital of the new republic. The slave insurgency, as it was called, was the largest in U.S. history, with 2 white men and 95 rebels losing their lives. The 95 slaves being killed by the militia and by post-trial executions. So 2 white men lost their lives and 95 enslaved lost their lives. And that was by militia and, of course, executions. Notice that I just said the term slave insurgency, and I said rebels, and I said slaves. And I'll repeat that. I said slave insurgency, rebels, and slaves. These are the terms that are used in most of the past and even current descriptions of the event. If you go on Wikipedia, you go anywhere, they use the term slave, they use the term rebels, and slave insurgency. It is right here, right now, that I'm going to change the terminology. I'm going to change the narrative, if you will. It was not a slave insurgency. It was a resistance movement. They were not slaves or rebels. They were enslaved persons, enslaved Africans. Better yet, they were freedom seekers. They were freedom fighters. When we refer to those colonists who sought to overthrow the British government in 1776 and beyond, we call them patriots. We call them freedom fighters. Today we even call those people, the colonists, the founding fathers, the Sons of Liberty, we call them heroes. But this group of men of color from 1811 who sought to overthrow tyranny and slavery are referred to as conspirators, traitors, renegades. A freedom fighter is defined by Merriam-Webster as a person who takes part in a resistance movement against oppressive political or social establishment. I'll say that again. A freedom fighter is defined by Merriam-Webster as a person who takes part in a resistance movement against an oppression that is political or social establishment. This is the definition that I will use here, for this is what these men and women were doing: resisting the political and social establishment. But I will also use the term freedom seekers, for that is an appropriate term. Approximately 64 to 125 enslaved men and women, freedom fighters, marched from the sugarcane plantations in and near the present-day Laplace, Louisiana, on what was called the German coast. And it was called the German coast due to the large number of people of German ancestry living there. And these people would march toward the city of New Orleans. As they marched, more and more black women and men joined them. Accounts vary, but it was estimated that approximately 200 to 500 freedom seekers, freedom fighters, participated. The uprising originated at the Andrew Plantation in Laplace, Louisiana. The identified leader of the revolution was a man named Charles Deslon, who historians believe was inspired by the Haitian Revolution of 1791 and 1804. Deslon was a free person of color. He was the son of a white planter and an enslaved woman, which wasn't rare, to be the son of a planter, a white planter, and your mother enslaved woman. His job was he was a slave driver. His job was slave driver. And they called them overseers, but he was a slave driver. That was his job. Deslon is believed to have met with a group of enslaved plantation workers on January 6, 1811. It was the period when work had been relaxed on the plantation after many weeks of harvesting and processing, so there was a little downtime. Many of the French planters who had escaped the Haitian Revolution only a few years before had settled in New Orleans with their enslaved. These enslaved persons had brought with them to Louisiana the powerful message of the story of the successful Haitian Revolution. So the planners brought their enslaved with them who had just experienced a Haitian revolution. Deslon would be one of those people. He would subsequently lead 300 to 500 enslaved persons in resistance against the U.S. institution of slavery. To capture the city of New Orleans, Deslon's strategy consisted of two-pronged military assault. And the first prong, he would create an army, go from plantation to plantation. Africans would join him, converge in New Orleans. The second prong was basically the people in New Orleans would rise up, and the two groups would join forces and take over New Orleans, and that would be the basis for their new republic, the Black Republic in Louisiana. For months, it is said that Deslon had allegedly spread word all through the plantations of the planned revolution. Among the slaves and the plantation up and down the German coast. And that's what historians have discovered, that word had gotten out. The uprising began on January the 8th when the freedom seekers first rose up on the plantation of Colonel Andrew in St. John the Baptist Parish. After wounding Andrew, freedom seekers allegedly killed his son. The freedom fighters overwhelmed their oppressors, armed with cane knives, hoes, axes, clubs, and a few guns, marched down the river road toward New Orleans. The resistance gained momentum quickly. During the 2-day, 20-mile march, the men are said to have burned 5 plantation houses, several sugar houses, and several crops. They reportedly marched to drums while they carried flags. And marching to drums is uniquely, something unique about this was the music they had, the rhythms, and that's Africa. But in terms of the flags they carried, this researcher is still unclear as to the flags that they carried, but my research continues. It is estimated that anywhere between 10 to 25% of the men and women on any given plantation joined with them. This researcher is not sure, however, of the role the women played in the revolution, and as I state, my research continues. But we do know, and I make a comparison, that the Bialystok uprising had as one of its leaders a woman. Heike Grossman was one of the primary organizers of the Bialystok Ghetto uprising. So the Bialystok uprising had a woman as one of its leaders. Not sure if in the German uprising, if there was a woman as one of its leaders. But let me say this. It is this researcher's humble contention that there has never been any significant historical movement or event where women have not played some sort of role. I think I need to say that again. It is this researcher's humble contention that there has never been any significant historical movement or event where women have not played some sort of role. Okay. Well, I'm not finished, but thank you. Tipped off by Colonel Andrew, men led by officials of the Louisiana Territory formed a military company. Then the U.S. soldiers, the U.S. government sent in soldiers. Then we had the Louisiana militia. So in the Battle of January 10th, 40 to 45 enslaved Africans were killed. Additional freedom fighters were caught and hung without a trial. And I just got it looks like a lot, but I only have a few more pages. It's almost done. On January 11th, the militia captured Deslon, and this freedom fighter received no trial, no due processes, and was executed. His hands were chopped off, and similar to the horrible fate of George Ward in Terre Haute, the person who was lynched in Terre Haute in 1901, he was burned. So similar to George Ward, he was burned. His body was set on fire to send a message to those who are still out there. It was said that you could hear his screams from miles away, and he was being burned alive. Man's inhumanity to man. Over the next 2 weeks, white planners and white officials interrogated, tried, executed, and decapitated, yes, I said decapitated, an additional 44 freedom seekers who had been captured. Executions were generally by hanging and firing squad. Heads of the victims were displayed on pikes to intimidate others. This display of heads placed on pikes on the levee stretched about 60 miles. So they would decapitate them and put their heads on a spike, a pike, and there were 60 miles of heads on pikes, all the way down for 60 miles. And that's like the distance between Terre Haute and Plainfield. So, and I actually have some pictures, not necessarily of that, but some pictures of that event that I'm going to show you in a little bit. Several escaped persons were returned to their so-called masters, for they were still valuable laborers, and the planters wanted their workers, and of course, you know, they still had, that was still their property, and they wanted their property back. So after the uprising, U.S. troops were brought to the Louisiana territory for protection. And as the U.S. troops came in, they could see all these heads on these spikes. I said pikes earlier, but on these spikes. They could see all these heads. You could see these heads for many, 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 many months to come. The owners of the enslaved were given $300 for the loss of their property. Each person who lost an enslaved person was given $300. It was then that the 19th century cover-up began. Very little was reported. The happy slave narrative ruled the day. Now I'm going to read you a quote by author and historian Leon Waters. He's the chairman of the Louisiana Museum of African American History. He's also a descendant of the 1811 freedom seekers, the freedom fighters. And this quote, I just love this quote. It says, begin quote, "The sacrifices of these brave men and women were not in vain. The revolt reasserted the humanity and redeemed the honor of the people. The uprising weakened the system of chattel slavery. It stimulated more revolts in the following years, and it set the stage for the final battle of the Civil War that put an end to this horrible system. The children and grandchildren of the rebels of 1811 finished the job in the Civil War. Louisiana contributed more soldiers, over 28,000, to the Union Army than any other state. 28,000 people, and a lot of those were the descendants of these people from 1811. These women and men of the 1811 revolution represented the best qualities of people of African descent. They were people of exceptional courage, valor, and dedication. These were women and men who put the interests and the welfare of the masses above their own personal desires. These were people who understood that the emancipation of the masses is a precondition for the emancipation of the individual," end quote. And at one part I'm going to repeat. "The sacrifices of these brave men and women were not in vain. The revolt reasserted the humanity and redeemed the honor of the people." This same quote can also be used to describe the freedom seekers at Bialystok. In recognition of such bravery, but also in recognition of such tragedy, a memorial to the 1811 German Coast uprising victims is located in the Whitney Plantation in Louisiana. The Whitney Plantation is located in St. John the Baptist Parish, Louisiana. The title of the parish, St. John the Baptist, is not lost on me as I narrate this story, for it was St. John the Baptist whose head was presented to Salome on a platter. The plantation was opened in 2014 and is the first plantation museum in the country dedicated to the enslaved person's experience. The Whitney Plantation includes a memorial and information to commemorate the 1811 enslaved persons uprising on the German coast. So at the plantation, there's a memorial to the victims of the 1811 revolution. In 2015, the artist Dred Scott, whose work is currently on display at ISU's groundbreaking show, Public Blackness. I hope you've seen that. You went out to see that amazing art exhibit. He began organizing a reenactment of the uprising. So starting in 2019, there is a reenactment of this 1811, I call it Revolution Uprising. Since 1995, the African American History Alliance of Louisiana has held an annual commemoration in January of the uprising, and the descendants of the 1811 victims participate in the uprising. Those events are attempts to reclaim this lost Tragic History. In February of 2022, this presenter and her family visited the Whitney Plantation. I am a child of New Orleans, having been born and raised there. Having passed Deslon Street and Andrews Street in the Lower Ninth Ward every day of my formative years, never knowing the significance of the streets, that Andrew was the plantation, and that Deslon was actually the so-called master of the Charles Deslon, who was the leader of the movement. So these streets in the Lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans, which is predominantly black, were named after slave masters. And this is the same Ninth Ward when Hurricane Katrina hit, pretty much wiped out the Ninth Ward. And that's where I grew up. But the streets, I never knew that until I researched this, that they were named after these slave masters. Okay, now I got emotional. Okay, the researcher was unaware of the Whitney Plantation Monument to Freedom Seekers. This researcher was also unaware of the Bialystok uprising. But upon seeing the monument at the Whitney Plantation, I was overcome with emotion. The heads of the 63 victims placed on the spikes, let's just go with either one of them, was mesmerizing and terrifying. I was struck by the sheer numbers of victims. I was also struck by the cruelty of man. But I was also struck by the boldness of the display. History was on full display for all to see. This event was no longer hidden. It was truth telling at its finest, but also at its most tragic. Each of the heads represented a person, one of God's children, a son, a brother, not just a piece of property. Meticulously displayed, adjacent to the monument, is the name of each victim on an attached placard, and they give information about each of the victims from 200 years ago. So somebody, someone, some researcher, people meticulously researched each victim and included their information on a placard to give them back their humanity. This moved me beyond words. In the same vein as I have tried to do when I present the George Ward story, I have tried to give the face a name and give a sense of humanity. And I think when we heard Arthur Feinsod and Dr. Kor today, Dr. Feinsod and Dr. Kor, they tried to give people a face, a name, and give a sense of humanity as well. I was moved by all the freedom seekers' names on the placards. I was exceptionally moved by all the names, and there were 63 victims, and somebody tried to find out about each victim and record as much information as possible. I was also moved by the knowledge that one of the presenters today, Dr. Feinsod, his great-grandfather lived in Bialystok, a part of Russia at the time. In the 1880s, to escape serving in the Russian army, he hid in a boat and sailed to the United States. And there he was able to start a new life for himself and his wife. And that's how Arthur Feinsod got here, so. And I'm going to show you guys some pictures in a minute, but I'm going to close now. In closing, I have pictures. Yeah, well, I'm just going to put up one. In closing, the actions of the freedom seekers were in many ways comparable to the actions of the so-called founding fathers of the United States, who had signed the Declaration of Independence only 35 years earlier. Both groups of revolutionaries, the 1811 freedom seekers and the 1776 patriots, knew that they would be killed if they lost their fight for freedom. Similar to the Bialystok uprising, each of the individuals who participated in the uprising was a mother, a father, a son, a daughter, a brother, sister, worker. Each was uniquely designed by the Creator. In taking the lives of these precious individuals, whether black or Jewish, man's inhumanity to man was in full display. But in rising up to fight against tyranny and oppression, these individuals, both black and Jewish, in the words of Leon Waters, reasserted their humanity and redeemed the honor of their people. Thank you. I'm just going to show you one quick picture, and I'm going to lay them out, and you guys can see them later. but I'm going to lay them out there so you guys can see them. And I didn't mean to offend any children, so thank you.
It's okay. Thank you for that talk, Dr. Reynolds. Some time ago, I caught a news program in mid-interview. The subject described his Hungarian Jewish family, how they escaped the Nazis. This experience led him to a serious philosophical study of authoritarian attitudes, and he concluded that the notion of tolerance, while it sounded nice, was insufficient for a healthy, functioning society. Tolerance, better than a pogrom, but offering no more consideration than, I put up with you until one day maybe I change my mind. What we need, he said, is acceptance. Acceptance creates an open society in which people are free to hold divergent opinions, and the rule of law allows people with different views and interests to live together in peace. Since that time, I've always equated George Soros, for he was the subject of the interview, with the humane, welcoming principle of acceptance. And so I was startled but not surprised to see George Soros's name elevated by the right as a globalist, a threat, his name representing their dog whistle for Jew. The authoritarian power structure, those who do not accept, have so many dog whistles, phrases designed to appeal to the mob, put the rest of us on the defensive, and ultimately threaten the survival of marginalized groups by excluding them from the culture and finally exterminating them. I merely mentioned Black Lives Matter, and to the entrenched right, that makes me a woke Zionist Antifa socialist teaching critical race theory to an immigrant caravan at Drag Queen Story Hour. And so what if it did? You know, two can play that game. I'll open carry my mifepristone and dare you to do something about it. I've listened as the sharing of coded phrases, Obama did it, and Nancy Pelosi sent middle-aged white men into spasms of infantile snickering, while I sat there mystified, wondering, what are these fools talking about? Rather than even consider the notion of acceptance, the intolerant would ban books, barricade bathrooms, deny bodily autonomy, brandish AR-15s, and otherwise trample human dignity. These expressions of injustice, authoritarianism, oppression, of hate, I do not accept, and I hope you don't either. Thank you for listening to my bar mitzvah speech. Terre Haute Stand Club is the student-led movement to end mass atrocities. The club has been in existence at Terre Haute South Vigo High School for the past 15 years. Stand has raised and donated thousands of dollars to many worthy organizations. Faculty co-sponsors are Jamie Luna Schatz and Peggy Grabowski. Stand will now conduct our memorial candle lighting.
We light this candle, a symbol of remembrance. On this Sunday afternoon, we remember and honor the 6 million murdered Jews, as well as the 5 million Roma and Sinti, physically and mentally disabled, Black people, Jehovah's Witnesses, Freemasons, Poles, political opponents, asocials, trade unionists, and homosexuals. We light a candle for family members that were murdered, the families that never came into existence, and the family members that were completely annihilated, lying in unmarked graves who have no one left to mourn their loss. We keep their memory alive as an act of solidarity in our own humanity.
We light this candle, a symbol of resistance. This Wednesday marks the 80th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, the largest single uprising of Jews during World War II. For nearly a month, hundreds of Jewish fighters resisted Nazi attempts to liquidate the ghetto and send them to concentration camps. Approximately 7,000 Jews died. These fighters were martyrs who demonstrated resilience and the epitome of physical resistance. We also remember the righteous among the nations who stood up for justice and light and risked their own lives to save fellow humans, like Irina Sendler, who saved more than 2,000 Jewish children from the Warsaw Ghetto. Because of Irina's courage and other righteous among the nations, the children had a chance to live, to hope, and to once again dream of a better world.
This candle symbolizes the remembrance of all genocide targets, even those occurring recently. The genocide in Darfur has spanned from 2003 to 2020. 300,000 targets have died from violence, starvation, and disease. 2.5 million people have been displaced from their homes, and at least 500,000 people remained displaced from their homes today. In addition, Chinese persecution has led to Uyghur Muslims being detained in camps where they are subjected to ill treatment and indoctrination. They are completely cut off from the rest of society and families. By continuing to learn about situations that sparked genocide in both the past and present, we are better able to combat genocide and prevent genocides in the future. Education is vital to stopping genocide.
This candle symbolizes Jewish spiritual resistance during the Shoah. Although Germans forbade religious services in most ghettos, Jews still prayed and held services in attics, cellars, and back rooms. Hundreds of these groups existed, helping to sustain morale, reaffirm cultural and religious identity, and supply spiritual comfort. This spiritual resistance defied Nazi attempts to dehumanize and strip Jews of their identities, and proves the power of non-physical resistance.
We light this candle to remember the failure to act in those times when it might have helped. In 1939, the ocean liner MS St. Louis sailed to Cuba, and then to the United States, and then to Canada, and all countries turned away the 937 Jewish passengers. Jews escaping the horror of persecution were also frequently denied visas. Many felt sympathy for the Jewish people, yet they chose to do nothing. Today, we recognize the times we should have spoken out or made a choice to act on another's behalf, but instead chose to physically and even emotionally distance ourselves, thinking we should mind our own business, or worse, concern ourselves with only ourselves.
This candle symbolizes how remembrance itself can be an act of resistance. Those in the ghettos never gave up and documented their resistance in news publications, journals, and through illegal libraries. Children wrote poems and illustrated art on walls. Some written work was secret, and some was not. Children in Terezin wrote poems like "I Never Saw Another Butterfly," and created innovative artwork in the midst of chaos and destruction. These efforts, even today, defy the narrative that Jews were blindly led to their deaths like lambs to the slaughter. These resistors inspire us to use our own talents in ways that positively impact the world around us, no matter what obstacles we ourselves may be facing. We all can be positive agents of change. We are the ones who can make a difference in this world.
We light this candle for those who live, even now, under the yoke of oppression in places throughout the world, from the Ukrainians, Uyghurs, and the Rohingyas, where the threat of genocide is real and omnipresent.
These candles represent how remembrance sparks resistance. By remembering the targets of the Shoah, we resist attempts to erase these people's identities. We learn to respect the value of life, and strengthen our humanity to act and help one another. This allows us to resist similar situations in a more meaningful way. As young people, it is especially important for us to enter adulthood with open eyes and open ears. By remembering the past, we gain the insight to resist in the present. This is a call to action for us to step it up in our daily lives and become the best version of humanity.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Sophie. Dr. Lori Henson has taught at Indiana State University's Communication Department since 2012. She works to make journalism and democracy more sustainable through education, advocacy, and research. She's an evangelist for nonprofit newsrooms, public media, solutions, journalism, the First Amendment, and the free press. Dr. Henson's topic is present-day threats to democracy with a focus on dangers faced by journalists.
Thank you all for having me here today. I've never been in this beautiful building, but I'm so pleased to be part of this important event. I'm honored to talk about journalism today because the stories that we've heard about the Holocaust and related resistance movements throughout history didn't start as history, right? Journalism is often called the first rough draft of history. And at the time that people were being enslaved, people were writing about it, and people were denying it in print. They were making arguments for it, they were making arguments against it. Those debates existed in the world, in newspapers. The legacy of truth-telling is a really critical component of justice and of democracy. And we cannot exist in this world in a democratic system without truth tellers, whether those truth tellers are resistors, activists, or journalists. And I was specifically asked today to talk about the present moment and the way that journalism has become a flashpoint for this argument about truth telling. So I have beautiful slides, but I'm not going to show them. If you want to see them, I'm happy to email them to you. But I will talk about what's in them. And I wanted to start by talking about truth tellers, starting with the Civil War and the Jim Crow era, including Ida B. Wells, who wrote about lynching in America, and in return had her newspaper burned to the ground, had to carry 1 or 2 pistols on her at all times, and had to move thousands of miles from her Memphis home in order to continue writing and truth-telling. We saw truth-telling happen with Hitler's rise in the 1930s. Mussolini in the 1920s was known to court the press. He was a showman. He was fantastical. He was il duce. And the American press and the worldwide press absolutely ate it up. They loved it. He was good for sales. We have seen modern leaders exhibit the similar kinds of showmanship that draws the press and turns a profit. And we have paid a price for that as well. We know that Dorothy Thompson was a truth teller in the 1930s. She wrote about meeting Hitler, interviewing Hitler. She talked about what a small, inconsequential man he was, and how it's not really possible to interview him because he talks as if he's talking to a crowd at all times, that he is so completely bent in a maniacal way that you can't really dig beneath the surface. And so she called out the threat of Hitler in the 1930s. And some people listened. But what we know from a recent historical author who wrote a book about journalists in World War II is that these stories that were being written would sometimes get buried on page 7, 8, 9, that editors who made those decisions would complain about, compassion fatigue, war fatigue. People were tired. They were tired of hearing about it. And the success of othering the people, the Jewish people, and other victims of the Holocaust kept American news audiences from acting. We also know that during the McCarthyism era and the communist scares of the 1950s, Edward R. Murrow was a truth teller, and he called out the mania and the illogic and the hatred and fear at the heart of McCarthyism. And now today, we have another crisis to face in journalism. And that crisis is that we have large areas of the country who don't have access to quality information, either because of news deserts, where newspapers have died, where newspaper staffs have been cut. Our own community is evidence of a diminishing of resources around journalism and news. When I interned at the Tribune-Star in 1994, there were probably 35 journalists in that newsroom. Today there are 4. Yeah. So this doesn't happen all of a sudden. These moments of the absence of good information, the absence of truth, and threats to truth tellers happens slowly over time, bit by bit, as we de-emphasize things that are important, as we criticize truthful information as woke or CRT or dangerous, right? What we know is that we also have politicians targeting journalists on purpose, calling them the enemy of the people, wearing shirts to Trump rallies that say rope, journalist, tree, some assembly required. Okay, 2016. We know that there are threats in the form of anti-press legislation. Ron DeSantis in Florida has promised to, quote, open up these libel laws that allow public people to sue journalists for stories that they don't like. And even conservative news outlets have pushed back on that to say that sword cuts both ways. You can't just reserve truth-telling for one political party or one side or one cause. We know that another threat is actual violence. In our own community, our Indiana State University alum, Jamal Khashoggi, lost his life, was targeted and killed for truth-telling about politics in the Middle East. And people around the world, despots around the world, from Vladimir Putin to others in the Philippines, in North Korea, all over the world, target truth-tellers as necessary for enacting larger demagoguery and tyranny. So this is the world that we are trying to address by respecting truth-tellers. In our post-truth era, as the Oxford Dictionary declared it in 2016, we have people whose strategy is to, quote, flood the zone with, I'll let you fill in the word, flood the zone with so much information, good, bad, untrue, conspiratorial, whatever it is, just flood the zone. And that way, nobody will know what's true. Nobody will have ground to stand on. And that is a strategy that is actively being meted out in our press today. We surround ourselves with filter bubbles, social media accounts that we like, that make us feel good, and it doesn't particularly matter whether those things are true or accurate. To some people, it still does, and I would encourage all of us to hold each other accountable for making sure that we're not just following news that makes us feel good, right? We know that Jeff Sharlet, a wonderful journalist and someone who has studied the right wing for many years, just wrote a book called The Undertow, and he calls this a global fascist moment, that fascism is having an actual moment in our history right now. And we know that the press has certain rules that it follows, and some of them are not helpful for addressing this fascist moment. We know that journalists have been reluctant to assert themselves as unapologetically pro-democracy, and that needs to end. journalism needs to be unapologetically pro-democracy. And in the words of journalism professor from NYU, Jay Rosen, if that's a fight we need to have, then maybe that's a fight worth having. We need to speak up when we hear people referring in code to globalists and the Jewish-controlled media and to Soros as code for misinformation, disinformation. We need to speak up when our own friends and family members are sharing things that we know are not true. And that takes courage. And I hope this is a reminder to myself, as much as it is to anyone, to have that level of courage when we see people sharing bad information. But I thought about what I could tell you all that wouldn't just bum you out. And the words of Mr. Rogers came to mind, which is look for the helpers, right? So who's helping? I think there are some wonderful helpers right now in the world. One is the Committee to Protect Journalists. That's an organization that protects journalists in a very physical, real way, but it also advocates for journalism all over the world. They map threats to journalism all over the world. The most recent has been the threat to a gentleman named Evan Gershkovich. If you've heard of him, he is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, an American who was detained by Russia and accused of spying. And he is now, incarcerated in Russia for the work that he was doing as a journalist. So there are also threats in the U.S., and we have a wonderful group called the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker and the Free Press Foundation, and they are tracking threats to journalists when they are arrested as part of covering protests, part of covering resistance movements, and are targeted for that work. There is a wonderful and amazing group called the Forbidden Stories Project, and the Forbidden Stories Project is maybe the bravest group I've ever heard of. And what they do is they take the work of journalists who were killed reporting a story, and they keep it going. And their mission is that you can kill the messenger, but you cannot kill the message. That's the work that they do, and they're amazing. What we also know is that journalists have learned some lessons from the past 5 or 6 years of covering an increasingly emboldened right-wing movement, from Charlottesville to Trump rallies to Black Lives Matter protests and the white supremacist reaction to it. The press has learned some lessons. We know today that NPR and other networks no longer broadcast Trump rallies live. They fact-check them first and then put them on. They also know that they have stopped using the word alt-right in favor of right-wing or racist or white supremacist or whatever more appropriate descriptive word should be there. We know that the AP style book, the Associated Press, has told journalists it's okay to say racist if it's racist. That's a thing that they didn't used to want to do. And they're like, no, you don't have to call it racially tinged or racially charged. You can just say racist if it's racist. So we are starting to use words more precisely. We are starting to call it what it is. We are starting to tell the truth with more confidence. And in the words of Timothy Snyder, who wrote a fantastic book called On Tyranny, he said, there are ways to defend against tyranny. There are ways to defend democracy. And one of those ways is to defend institutions, including the rule of law and including the press, an independent and nonpartisan press. Believe in truth. Don't be afraid to defend the truth, even when it upsets you. One of my favorite descriptions of journalism is that a journalist is someone who is willing to disappoint themselves with the truth, right? And Timothy Snyder also tells us to investigate. and support investigation and investigators. And we've seen recently the big investigation about Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. That investigation was done by a nonprofit newsroom called ProPublica. And we see other nonprofit newsrooms, not driven by advertising dollars, serving only the public that pays them to do their job. And there are other projects springing up all over the country with this mission in mind. And so there are reasons for hope. I wanted to end with a quote from Jay Rosen, again, a fantastic journalism professor at NYU, and he says, "If being pro-democracy while maintaining high standards in matters like verification, proof, weight of evidence, fairness, and intellectual honesty draws backlash from some, maybe that's a fight we need to have." So thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Dr. Henson. Sister Emily TeKolste is a grassroots mobilization specialist for Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice. She's an advocate for love, mercy, and justice. She's here to talk about putting construction into constructive resistance.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. And I know that we've all heard a lot of really powerful stories today. If you're like me, you're feeling maybe a little bit heavy, maybe a little bit hopeful. Thanks, Lori, for especially that last piece. I was starting to feel really down, but for bringing us up and ending on hope. I am an organizer, so I like to interact with you, but I also am very cognizant that we've all been sitting for a little while, so I want to invite you to just take a moment to stand up and stretch. Get your blood moving, get back into your bodies a little bit. All right, so really quickly, just to kind of help you locate me, I am an organizer for a Catholic social justice lobby based in DC, although I do live here in Terre Haute. I'm an Indianapolis native, and I do want to just name the work that I do, maybe. There we go. So Network educates, organizes, and lobbies for economic and social transformation. We work at the federal level, and we train folks to do their own citizen advocacy. So you are citizens, we live in a democracy, and sometimes it feels like we don't have a lot of power, but we really have more than sometimes we think we do. And I do want to name specifically the work that we do because we recognize that our society is broken. It was built on broken foundations. We were built on the theft of land from Native Americans and the enslavement of African peoples, and that we have a lot of work to do to undo that, because that is the root of the society in which we live. That is the root of a lot of the privilege that we have as a nation internationally, and especially that white people in our nation have a lot of privilege as a result of that. So we believe that we must dismantle systemic racism, cultivate inclusive community, root our economy in solidarity, and transform our politics. We do this through 5 policy areas. I'm not going to get into too many details right now. And we do this in collaboration with a number of organizations. So these are just some of our secular and interfaith partners at the national level. And then we also work with a bunch of organizations in various localities. But I want to start with this, and I'm going to ask you to tell me, I know the slides are a little bit hard to see, but as you can see, tell me what you see here. Fish? A big fish, lots of little fish, what's going on? The big fish is eating the little fish. And what are the little fish doing? Just trying to swim away. It's the bear story. You don't have to run faster than the bear, you just have to run faster than the slowest person in your group, right? What about here? See a bigger fish going after a smaller fish? All the little fish, yes. All the little fish have come together. And I think that is, if you take anything away from this conversation, or what I have to offer to this conversation today, I hope it's this image. Because to me, this is just such an important piece of the puzzle. It's such an important thing for us to remember that when we come together, we have power. And at the heart of this is relationships. So the Reverend Jen Bailey of Faith Matters Network says relationships are built at the speed of trust, and social change happens at the speed of relationships. Relationships are built at the speed of trust, and social change happens at the speed of relationships. Which kind of means it's a slow process sometimes. So for me, a metaphor that really helped me in my early justice days was that of a gauge. A laugh-o-meter, a clap-o-meter, however you want to frame it. Sister Alice Gerdeman, who was one of the justice mentors of mine, said to me that our goal is never to move someone from here to here. So if we think of red as the exact opposite of where we are on a number of things, our goal is never to move someone from where they are to where we are. Our goal is simply to help them get a little bit closer, and that can take a number of different forms. So we want to just kind of start to invite people to think a little bit differently, or if they already think like us, then to act a little bit differently, to take some of that power back. So I'm going to offer a kind of a quick framework for some of the social change work that we can do, and then I'm going to offer some skills for some interpersonal work that we can do. And I want to name that a lot of the things that I'm offering are just kind of putting a different set of words around themes that our other presenters have offered today. And so their stories, I think, can really help to flesh this out if you can connect to some of the things that were shared here earlier. So the first is, oops, wrong way. There we go. Components of advocacy. I said at the beginning that Network educates, organizes, and lobbies for economic and social transformation. And I think those three pieces are just really important frameworks. We're educating ourselves, we're educating others, we're organizing, we're coming together to build those connections, and then we're lobbying. We're looking to our policymakers to say, what are the policies that we need to change, and how can we build a society that works for all of us? Because that's ultimately the goal that we have. I think everyone here has that goal that we really want to build a society that works for all of us. And you may not be able to see on the slide, but there are arrows pointing both directions between each of those three different components. And I think that's really important. Each of these things can be achieved through a variety of tactics, and those tactics can often cover more than one of these goals at any given moment. So educate, as I said, educate ourselves, educate others. This can be a great way to bring people in and to build new relationships like we're doing today. Thank you especially for the social time after this to begin to do some of that. Be creative. What are the creative ways that you can use to educate? Arthur's play, the beautiful candlelighting ceremony from our stand students. So many different examples, even just that we've talked about today in this room. Organize. Organizing is about building principled and ordered, sustained relationships around self-interest and shared values in order to build power. So that's a lot of big words, but I think what's important are relationships, shared self-interest, and shared values, because we come to and stay in movements because we believe they are good for us. But that's not the same as selfishness, because my self-interest can be shared with your self-interest, and so when we can come together and recognize that a society that works for all of us works better for all of us. then we can understand why there are groups like patriotic millionaires who say tax us more. Because they know that, and the data shows this, that a society that works better for the least wealthy in the society is, according to every public health indicator that exists, is better for the most wealthy. So we talked a little bit about power. What do you think of when you think of power? How would you define power? Influence. Control. So, different forms of power. Power with or power over. And I think Sister Jan just got to kind of the difference between the first two answers we had. So we think of power as the ability to make change. And we want to build power. And the kind of the equation, if we're going to go with a math analogy here, is that power comes from organized people plus organized money. And so there are some people in our society who have a lot of money, and without coordinating among people, they can wield a lot of influence. They have a lot of power. But we have a lot of people, right? And so when we can come together and build that group of people into these relationships around shared self-interest, then we can wield power as well. We can change our society. And so the third piece is lobbying, and lobbying is just about educating and influencing our elected officials. And we remember, they work for us, right? So there are a number of tactics that we can use, and I'm not going to get into the specifics of that, but what I want to share is really quickly just this information from the Congressional Management Foundation. And so they have reached out to staff and all of the members of Congress offices and said, what are the most influential forms of communication from your constituents? And you can kind of see this dark blue is, they said this particular form has a lot of influence over our member of Congress. The light blue is it has some positive influence over our member of Congress. And what I want to highlight here is just this last one. Form email messages. A few clicks, type your name in, maybe your address, maybe it autofills for you and you don't even have to do that. 56% of congressional offices say that has some influence on the way their member votes on an issue. So even just something that's a really light lift has a significant influence. And it just goes up from there in a number of different tactics. So that's one framework that I want to offer. And I know I'm going through this really quickly. This is just the top lines. But another framework I want to offer is kind of the interpersonal piece. Because our elected officials, once they're elected, they have their own self-interest. They're going to do the things that they're going to do. We can also influence who gets elected, and who we elect matters. We can influence the conversations we're having in our society, and we can do that through the relationships that we have. So this next space might be something more like with somebody who identifies really in a different perspective, has a different perspective than you do. And maybe the goal is to move them just a little bit further towards where you think they are. And so I think that's a really hard thing to ask, and this isn't something that everyone is called to do, but some of us might, in some of our relationships, have some opportunities to have conversations that really start to transform hearts and minds. But before we do that, I want to give some framework for kind of some of the barriers that we face when we do that, because I think these are really, really important to understand so that we can engage effectively. So the first, and perhaps the most powerful, is the backfire effect. And this is a psychological thing that happens in us, where if somebody attacks our worldview, or we think they're attacking our worldview, we actually go into fight or flight response. And so we either shut down or we fight. When what that means in practical terms is when given evidence of something that counters their worldview, people will, and this is everybody, people will naturally believe even more strongly in their initial position. So you may say, that's not true and here's why, and they say, the response that we all have is, actually, I'm going to find every piece of information I can to prove that I was right all along. And so there are ways around this, and I'm going to present one of them today. Another big piece is what Bill Bishop, a sociologist and political scientist, has written about called the big sort. We tend to live and hang out with people who think like us, and so we just don't encounter opposing views as much. There's an increasing move towards ideological purity, especially within those who are politically active. So this chart here really highlights that the more politically active you are, the more ideologically pure you are, the more extreme you are in your perspectives. And that could be liberal perspectives, that could be conservative perspectives. You just tend to move more towards the extremes. And the last one is political motive asymmetry. And this actually was a political science philosophy that came out of the Cold War era. So you think of the US versus the USSR, and it says that we basically assume that our motives are good, and therefore our actions are good or can be justified, even if the actions, the ends justify the means kind of thing. And we assume that our opponents' motives are bad, and therefore their actions are bad, and we kind of get lost in those two extremes. But what we also know is there's this kind of what we call the iceberg of conflict. We have these positions, and those are the things that we say, those are the things that are visible, and underneath those positions are some assumptions, and those assumptions may or may not be based in fact, but they exist. But underneath those assumptions are the aspirations and the values that we hold, the things we hope for our families and for our society, and that's where there's a lot more ability to connect than maybe we realize when we're just looking at the positions. And so when we can take a step back and say, okay, let's get down to that level, then we can connect in a different way than we might have otherwise. When we're just looking at facts, or we're just looking at, facts are important, all of those things are important, but can we connect in new and different ways with people? So again, relationships are key. The most important piece of changing somebody's worldview is an authentic and respectful relationship. And so you have to be respectful of the other person, but it's also really important, and sometimes I forget this, especially in some of my relationships with my family, and I get into like a manipulative space, but it's important to be authentic and grounded in our own perspectives and our own positions. So really quickly, I know this is honestly an hour and a half long presentation that I give sometimes, so I'm going to just do top lines, I promise. But 5 steps to having an effective conversation. Before we get to the conversation, as I said, it's important to be in a space where you are in a good space, where you're grounded, you've practiced self-care, and you can remember what you like about the other person in that conversation. What is it that you appreciate about the relationship? I think Arthur kind of alluded to this when he told of his friend in Germany who said, well, how can you even be friends with me? And he said, well, you're not your ancestors' actions, right? And so being able to remember those things in ourselves, to have that kind of compassion. So 5 steps. Go in with a healthy sense of curiosity. Inquire openly. One pro tip, avoid asking the question why. That sounds judgmental. We don't mean it to, but sometimes it just comes across as judgmental. So something like, tell me more, can be more open-ended and people can be more receptive. Listen. Oh, I forgot a couple of clicks, didn't I? Be curious. Listen. I don't know if you've ever been in a conversation where you just feel like you haven't been listened to. What does that do to you? It's not good. I got a thumbs down, right? For me, I know it makes me fight more, right? I fight more. I'm more likely to feel like I need to justify and talk louder just to be heard. And so it's really important to help the folks we're in conversation with to feel heard. But it's also important for ourselves to get down to that aspirational level, to understand where they are coming from in a deeper way, because again, that's where we can connect. We want to make sure that they know that they're heard by reviewing. I heard you say this. Is that what you meant? And just making sure we have some clarity around it. We want to validate. We might not say, yes, that's a perfectly valid opinion, right? Because sometimes it's not. But finding what's the fear, validating the feelings that they might be experiencing. And only after we do all those four that are really focused on the other person do we express our own perspective. And another pro tip, stories are particularly potent and powerful, especially for the validate, or you think of it as like a connecting. I can tell you a story that connects with yours. It might not affirm the position, but it can connect with the feelings that somebody might be experiencing in a particular situation. And then we want to express in a way that kind of expands their viewpoint. So we're not fully displacing their worldview, but we're just kind of expanding it a little bit at a time. And so I think those are really important things to keep in mind. I truly believe that societal transformation happens at an individual relationship level. And so each of you here, if you were to go out and have one conversation or two conversations in the next month, look around. What do we have? I'm bad at estimating numbers, but probably 40, 50 people here. We could start to expand the hearts and minds of 50 to 100 people just by each of us committing to having one conversation with someone who might have a different perspective. And that can slowly, over time, it takes a while, but it changes the world. And that's powerful. I said the important thing is relationships, and the important thing, we talked about lobbying. So I just want to really quick plug, if you want to get involved in advocacy work, if you want action alerts to help you know when to influence policy, when to call your legislators, you can text WELCOME to 202-347-9797, and that'll get you signed up for action alerts from my organization. So we send out action alerts to just a phone call usually, and the link will be in the text message, makes it super easy, and then you can start to be a part of influencing policy on that level as well. So thank you all so much. Thank you to all of our wonderful presenters and organizers. This has been just wonderful.
Thank you, Sister TeKolste. Thank you to all our speakers, to all of you for attending this extended Yom HaShoah event. And now to wrap things up, UHC President Betsy Frank with concluding remarks.
Well, thank you all for attending this wonderful presentation. I'd like to give a special thanks to Scott Skillman, who organized this event, and I know he spent a lot of time. And I would be remiss if I didn't remember Terry Fear, who 4 years ago hosted this, coordinated this event, and sadly passed away shortly thereafter. And a special thanks to, is it the Honey Creek Ward? I got it right, Chris. The Honey Creek Ward of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who has a wonderful reception for you downstairs. So I invite you to go downstairs, and thanks again to all of you who attended and participated.